Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, we'll go have that in-depth look into pistols. As we've gone through most of the other weapon types, especially with DPS tables, this will be actually the final one where we be using DPS tables. Looking into the big list of pistols, as the spreadsheet for it has been done for quite a while. This is putting the weapon on a build, a specific build. We'll look into what it is in a second, together with a bunch of the talents that we will commonly choose to use with those, together with some of the exotics as well. So we can kind of compare it basically on a build, because especially in the pistol category, there's quite a big of difference between some of the weapons, especially if you just look at the normal DPS tables, because they have wildly different amounts of mods that they can take, and even more so than where you have without mod 0, with all mods 15 crit chance, usually on pistols that can be 20, because they have a 10 crit chance under barrel. And yeah, everything will be timestamped down below, as you can, so you can jump around. We'll first go kind of through the premise and kind of the scope of what we're discussing here. Then we'll take it into showing the build that we'll be specifically using for this, because that, of course, matters quite a bit for the results, because it is the results for that specific build, but we can kind of take the bigger picture out of that. And then we'll start with the burst and DPS, go into the sustained DPS side of things, kind of discuss them. First, kind of the weapons in between them each other, and then as well the talents and how they kind of affect the outcomes. And then also we'll kind of look briefly at Headhunter. This video is definitely more about DPS pistoling, basically, where we are shooting at max RPM. We're not going Headhunter, we're going more shooty side. Basically, we're not hunting the heads, we're just shooting as much as we can. And yeah, on the Headhunter side, we'll look at what the pick is for Headhunter. Spoiler warning, it's the harvest. And then we'll also of course do that review at the end, which might be the point where you might want to jump to if you don't want to watch everything here. The review will kind of be where we'll go to my stash. I have all of the pistols there. We'll go basically weapon type by weapon type, and I'll kind of give my thoughts on each one and how I feel about them and if it's worth using or not. So yeah, let's go get started with our premise. And to set our premise and scope, kind of, we have, of course, the DPS tables here. This is the folder containing all of them, as well as the file we'll be discussing in a second, the pistol one, that is the 6.0. We, of course, had the main big file here set to the pistol tab. It's the tabs at the bottom, as I know some people don't know that. It's kind of behind me, but yeah, that is where you can switch between weapon types. We have the pistols, and the pistols are somewhat unique in this, as they have, while we on other weapons have received the option to swap between crit chance and crit damage mods. On pistols, actually, only the muzzle generally has the ability to swap between 5 crit chance and 15 crit damage. The optics rail, the short optics rail, does not have the 10 crit damage mod. The underbarrel that the pistols use also does not have a crit damage mod, but there actually we have a 10 crit chance. So there is wildly differing amounts of crit chance per weapon, ranging from basically 0 to 20. A much wider range than, for instance, with SMGs or such, where we have 3 mod slots, each 5 crit chance or 10 crit damage if they have the long on the barrel. And that makes it so that we kind of need to compare them on a build. Now, generally as well, we use pistols in 2 different ways. One is Headhunter, where we try to go for the highest hit, basically. We'll discuss that more so towards the end. Although, of course, we'll come back for the list down here where we sorted by base for that. That we can do basically without this, but especially in here, we're kind of thinking more about it in a way where we're maining the pistol, and the build I'll show in a second as well kind of does that. We're maining the pistol in a kind of crit chance, crit damage kind of sense, where we're firing it out. We're basically treating it as we would an automatic weapon. We're trying to fire it as fast as possible and get DPS basically out of it, instead of where Headhunter, you're not per se firing at the rate, you're more so trying to get one-hit kills, and you're firing basically when the opportunity is there to fire, not so much when the interval has gone. So for this, yeah, we'll be sticking kind of to a DPS sense, which actually, of course, is kind of not per se the way that you often will use pistols, so be aware of that. And then on specifically the list that we're using, as always, so on this one, we do also not have a coyote, so there's no coyote ranges active. We're kind of dealing as if with it as well. So if we're solo, we're not per se set up for somebody else to, for instance, provide us coyote. We're doing this again at a grade 27. We're doing this as well with a 20% headshot rate set and 60% DTA, although the DTA does not apply to anything in this list, so yeah, that is kind of meaningless. But we are doing 20% headshot rate, which of course will apply a little bit to some talents, and also of course will limit our amounts of DPS output. But I feel 20% headshot is kind of in a ballpark where that is what we would hit. And of course, yeah, this will affect as well talents that are crit damage based, as those are added to each other. This build also then has a memento, which we haven't seen before. I am adding the memento in as fully maxed. We have intimidate also as fully maxed, and also here just to take that opportunity again to point that out, that intimidate is self-multiplicative. It isn't 9 stacks of additive 1.04s together. It is actually 9 stacks of 1.04s multiplicative to each other. So basically they're just separate multipliers for each of the stacks, meaning that at full we land on this awkward 42.3312 and a bunch of other numbers behind that, but we're truncating it to that. And yeah, intimidate at full, we're kind of expecting, we're kind of giving the best chances to the build as it can, but it is a tech tank style of build. So it isn't actually that all into damage. We'll kind of see in a moment. I've actually been enjoying it, and I've kind of been happy to have it back into the build collection. And then, of course, we have the things that some talents that we're using in here don't have effectively always uptime. That goes actually for a lot of talents, because for instance, as we have sadist here, sadist of course requires a bleed to be on the enemy, to be active. That just isn't always there. Now, of course, if you're playing alongside of an OD or something, you have much higher uptime than this. You might even have close to perfect uptime to this. But then as well, things like killer, of course, will activate off of a kill. So definitely for the very first kill, it's not active. I'm kind of expecting you for yourself to kind of set how active you think something will be, because it is so dependent. Even for myself, if I were to give an answer, the answer is going to be completely different if I'm solo or in a group, if I'm doing a mission, or if I'm in the open world, for a lot of talents, because it's going to differ quite quickly. So we're kind of just leaving that discussion to the side. We're not having that discussion at all. We're just giving the data that discussion would have as the result, basically. So yeah, do keep that in mind. And that doesn't per se also mean that just because sadist is higher than, for instance, killer, doesn't mean that I'm going to go with sadist just because this number is higher, because the conditionality of it matters quite a bit. Then we have also the exotics, which of course kind of have the same traits, as we'll discuss when we get to them. And then yeah, the list, of course, of pistols is there's a bunch of them. We'll try to keep it quite brief, but yeah, this then being the premise. Let's go actually look at what build we're using these on. And that build is looking like this. This is actually as well 1.14 on the build collection as we have it here. And this is actually the replacement kind of for the high-end normal tech tank, which used to be an AR tech tank. I altered it back to be actually a build style that I used to have quite a bit in the past, which was pistol-based bulwark tech tanks. And especially for the high-end, that works decently well, because we can just get a bunch of the bonuses. Nowadays as well, one of the reasons I got rid of a lot of them was back when the original Intimidate kind of alteration, going from instant to needing 7 seconds to stack up. When those happened, I kind of, that really did hurt Intimidate back then. Nowadays, Intimidate is very usable again. And as well, we have other tools like, for instance, Picaros here together with a second piece Brazos that can actually be really good for high-end setups like this, which can make use of the yellow cores and such. Then actually, this is one of the better ways to set that up. But of course, I'm going as well with a DNH, a Grupo, and a Fox's Prayer here for the more damage that we can put out. As well, actually, so the layout as I finally got it, as I'm kind of proud of it in the end, is yeah, the guy actually just put in a Cheska chest here and go to a Crusader. And honestly, and then we're back actually to being an AR-based high-end tech tank. Although the high-end tech tank in the AR version is kind of, yeah, the Heartbreaker, the tech tanks, the Heartbreaker tech tank, the Striker tech tank kind of add to it. So I was okay giving it up for for a pistol bulwark. And of course, with this one, we're kind of using it for weapons-wise, basically in a DPS sense. Because, of course, if we were using a headhunting build or something, that is a completely different discussion. The weapon we would use for that, it's kind of set already. So kind of spoilered it already. It would be a Harvest, failing that, a 5.86 or a 6.86. But here we're actually trying to fire at the RPM of the weapon and trying to basically do it in a shooty sense instead of a headhunter sense. And yeah, I've been kind of enjoying this build. It works pretty well, especially you can take pretty easily 8 directives. You can even push it up to 10 directives in Summit. And just for running around, it is actually a tech tank that can kind of deal with Pistolero pretty easily for itself. And then, yeah, here we've been using multiple weapons. As you can kind of see here, the weapon I kind of went with is a M45A1 together with a Killer. Although as well, I have at the ready and been messing around with a Cart 45 for it as the main weapons as well with Killer, because Killer works really well as we'll see in a second as well. And yeah, this was the layout then that we're going to be using here. It is pretty low on crit chance, crit damage overall. If we go to the pistol, it is, for instance, here, it is 60, 130. It is a flat 60, exactly 60 basically, and a 130 when we hold 20 crit chance weapon like we have here with the M45 or the Tactical 1911 or the Card 45. So yeah, let's go and actually see then what this build makes happen on that DPS table. And yeah, let's kind of start going through the big list. Although the list itself is not as big as some of the other ones, mostly because we're not using that many talents. Not that many talents kind of apply well to pistols. We're going to, of course, zoom in a little bit in a second. But yeah, the stats here derived is basically all of the stats are going on the right side. And we're kind of deriving a DPS both in burst and sustain just from those stats. That's actually how these calculators basically work together, just to also point that out. Then, as we have had with all of the other ones, is that I'm not putting the 100% point at basically the top of the table. We're pulling it down a little bit to generally basically the first high-end weapon, because some of the exotics especially will have much higher numbers basically than in special situations like we have here with the Busy Lil B at 10 stacks, which is kind of unrealistic. But because of that as well, we're kind of going with some of the more realistic numbers, and also just to make sure that we don't squish the lower parts together, because it's kind of hard to make out percentage differences if we're already starting with this one, for instance, being at 75% or such, or 70%. So yeah, we're moving the 100% down. So everything's comparing in this top slot to this M45A1 and TAC 90 M1911. Both of those are variants of each other. That's also important to know that there's a bunch of weapons here, as with a lot of as with a lot of places. For instance, the Mark 16s or such, or ACRs, they basically have all of the same heart stats. They just differ in variants. Sometimes they can have different mods. If they do have different mod types and such, leading to different numbers, yeah, we will of course separate them out because we would need to. But here, for instance, these two are variants of each other, and technically the TAC 1911 is slightly better stability and pulls up a little bit less in A/B testing next to each other than the M45. And the reason I was using M45 on that build is because it has a cool skin, and that matters too. So yeah, let's get started actually with the exotics here. We'll go through the exotics, then we actually compare kind of the weapons to each other, and then go a little bit deeper into talents versus each other. But let's start with exotics, and we'll see Busy Lil B here at the top. This is 10 stacks of Busy Lil B's own talent. So we would need to hit 10 enemies swap to a different talent or swap to a different weapon, swap back to the Busy Luby and start using it. And then we only also have it for 10 seconds. Not a very realistic scenario to create. Busy Luby, of course, can be very usable and does, of course, for some shenanigans get used very specifically where we get a bunch of stacks, even hot swap to Regulus for even higher damage numbers as for instance, a bunch of speedrunners will do for certain things. For general use, you have to swap off of the weapon and back to trigger the talent on the pistol, and that is very much doable. I have actually tried doing it. You can get up to 10 stacks as well because it just keeps remembering how many stacks you've made, but this does mean that you've encountered 10 enemies at least, right? You can apply this to the 11th enemy. And even for that, we don't really get very high burst numbers, especially when we are comparing to, for instance, Sadis just below it. But even, for instance, the killers as they start arriving here are below it, of course, but they're going to have much more activeness than this. They're going to be active for much more of the time than Busy Luby would be. Busy Luby, of course, is very usable. It is very situationally a great tool because, of course, it does give you 20 weapon damage per enemy hit and marked basically before you swap off of it. But that also, in that meantime, you could have also killed a bunch of enemies is kind of the thing. Then we see actually Liberty here with 30 stacks. For this, we also have it in two ways, basically, because for it to reach 30 stacks, we have to hit body shots. As we hit body shots, it increases weapon damage as the talent of Liberty goes. That does mean, of course, that we could not really have headshot percentage as we have at the 20% that we kind of have it, as we have that here. We can't really have that because if we're headshotting 20% of the time, that means 1 in 5 shots. You can't reach 30 stacks and have that. So we do actually have a different variant of it here where we're actually removing the headshot and then just body shotting and trying to get that weapon damage percentage out. But here, if we magically somehow got to 30 stacks with 20% headshot rate, which is kind of impossible, the Liberty would be one of the top weapons. But this is, of course, kind of an unrealistic number. We also have it on 15 stacks and then also later on 0 stacks. The thing is, we can better actually look at it, and let's go do that already here with the Liberty here at 30 stacks and then no headshot. So we're removing the headshot component completely, which also kind of hinders it as it does have a headshot mod a little bit. So even then, if we're just body shotting continuously, it is kind of in the pack. It is, for instance, the Card 45 here with Killer Active is kind of next door to it. This, of course, does need 30 shots already to get to this point. The 15 is... Oh, it is actually below. So here we see a quirk that we've created, because here we have the Liberty with just 20% headshot rate and basically not having any stacks of that weapon damage active. It is actually higher than the 15 stacks without any headshots, because here, of course, we're removing the headshot. We're basically setting the headshot to 0. So it ends up actually at 15 stacks if we're not headshotting, below the Liberty and just not having it at not trying to stack basically up. We're basically doing 4 shots and then getting a headshot, although we're not even inputting those weapon damage in there. Because, of course, not headshotting at all does reduce our number quite a bit. And, of course, for instance, the build setup that I kind of had that on, we can't get very close. We can just stick our pistol kind of in their face and actually get some headshots in. But, we create basically this interesting quirk here where the 15 stack, no headshot Liberty is below just the Liberty without any of its talent active, but still having that 20% headshot. And actually, so even without really using its talent, it is actually pretty high up here. Its biggest downside, of course, is its handling. It is a handful, even if you're just going for the body shots and kind of getting those stacks in. There is a bunch of weapons that will outdo it, especially for this like 30 stacks, because we can see that, especially the tactical M45 or tactical M1911 or the M45A1 killer is kind of much higher than it, which is kind of the one that I went with. And of course, we'll have around the same uptime because here that 30 stacks with no headshots is below it, but the main one is even further below it. It's like 7% behind. When we kind of look at it here. Then as well, we have the busy little bee at 5 stacks, a much more gettable number, and there it is actually kind of in the pack of sadist. It of course, yeah, has very low mods is kind of its issue. That's what kind of reduces it versus its base weapon. But then with a few stacks, we can kind of make up for that, of course. I wouldn't per se main busy little bee, but of course, yeah, the way that we generally use it is we use it situationally, we get the weapon damage out of it, and then usually we do something with that weapon damage, is kind of interacting with it, either pestilence or headhunting are the two big ones that kind of feed off of weapon damage. And yeah, the busy little bee can be very good for those moments, but you already know those moments when you need those. Then let's go find ourselves the Regulus here being used without actually considering its explosion at all, but just using it as a DPS weapon. And it's actually surprisingly high up, honestly. But the way that we use the Regulus, of course, is that it's much more of a headhunting weapon. We try to get Headhunter going with it and then make the explosions happen alongside of it, hitting other enemies. Here, of course, we're not giving any consideration for the explosion at all, so we're just kind of doing the DPS numbers of it. But actually, it is surprisingly high and somewhat usable, actually, even in a DPS sense, because of course, we get kind of a little bit of the explosions alongside of this, adding a little bit of damage. And actually, it was surprising to me how high this was, and it's somewhat usable. The thing is, of course, it's a 6-shotter, and then it has a reload. Handling-wise, it is actually decent, much more decent than, for instance, a Liberty would be. So you could actually use the Regulus in a DPS sense, as we're kind of using it here, just as a shooty gun instead of a headhunter gun. Then we have the Mosquito here with the 25% amp of it active, so triggering that amp basically, and then shooting, continuing to shoot the enemy with it. This of course means that we're 5 shots in already, and then we're kind of hitting this. And of course, this isn't that high up. We're already pretty far behind the top of the list. And then the downside of the Mosquito is very much that it's without being activated. It is very much that kind of weapon as we also have here at the bottom with the busy little bee. The Mosquito is very much at the very end of the list. It is basically a military M9, but then without the ability to put those mods in there. So its mods are fixed, and it shows when it doesn't have a talent active. The busy little bee, same as well. When we don't have any stacks going on it, this is kind of also the downside of the busy little bee. When you're kind of stacking it up, it is in this form, basically, because the talent isn't active yet. And that eats into your damage quite a bit. Same for the Mosquito. Although, of course, both of them do special things here as well. The Mosquito will also draw enemies to you, force them for a little bit to kind of be aggroed to you. We use it much more in that sense, and also then we really don't use it as a damage thing. It's just, you're just firing it at an enemy to both get the debuff on them and then also try to aggro them, which for tank builds and such will make it alongside of the Liberty, where we use that for its component of healing the shield. You have basically 2 choices there now, which is actually kind of nice for them. So we kind of went through the exotics. Let's now go and start with the high ends. And going into the high ends, overall, as we had already with the burst tables over here, just the main burst tables, we could already kind of see, of course, what the interburst would be of the weapons, but of course we couldn't see what their crit chances would affect that. And that's a big reason why these lists are much more for utility, just if you want the stats and having those. For inter-comparing between weapons, we kind of need it to be on a build. Because here we see that, well, the 1911, as was in that big list, was much higher than everything else around it, of course. It also, shows 0 crit chance. That means we can't put any crit chance mods on it. It does have the magazine slot, so we can't take the magazine up, but it doesn't have the other slots. And then this 1911 was basically the first weapon with 20 crit chance that was this high up. That's already kind of made me feel like this is likely the top pick overall. And actually, yeah, when we take it into a build, we see that that is actually the case. The M45 and the TAC 1911, as I'll be referring to them from now on, they are a little bit higher burst and sustain than the 1911 non-tactical, which doesn't have the ability to have those mods. And then you would here, though, of course, we're on the build, we've set up the crit chance to make up for that loss of the mods, so that we land on as good of a stats as we can make for that weapon. What we see then is, yeah, that it is a tiny loss to go with, for instance, for that 1911. You could still go for this, and then of course, especially if you're using a build that because this does hit a tiny bit harder per shot, so it does go a little bit further with those 18 shots. Although even then, it doesn't actually out sustain our M45 really, but the damage per mag is of course a little bit higher. But not a big issue. The reloads on pistols are still pretty quick. But then as well, we have the Card 45, which used to be the old king. It was very much higher in burst and sustain than anything else in the category, basically. In PTS1, they actually took it very low. In PTS2, they brought it up a little. Kind of the same story as the MP7 kind of had, where, yeah, they kind of overdid it on PTS1. They brought it back up a little bit in PTS2, made it close to usable. In the case of the Card 45, though, it is actually usable. We're giving up a little bit of a burst if we go with it. We get a much better reload and mag size. The RPM is the exact same. And we gain actually a lot of sustain. So to me, the big pick in this category, as I kind of also showed with the choices that I had made for the build itself with the weapons chosen there, going with either the M45 or the TAC 1911, which are basically variants of each other. The 1911 actually does have a little bit better handling out of the two, pulling up a little bit less. Its stability bar is also showing that a little bit. It's a tiny bit fuller, but M45 actually has the cooler skins, so yeah, I'm kind of going with those. And then the Card 45 as well, very handleable, as also all of these are pretty handleable still. We'll see later on with, yeah, for instance, the D50, where we'll kind of discuss how they handle as well alongside of it. But yeah, this is kind of the two that I very much choose between, especially for a build like that. And yeah, it is definitely that sustain can sometimes be nice. The difference in reload can definitely be felt. The difference in damage, and this doing a little bit more bursty damage, is also definitely felt. So yeah, I kind of actually like having both and kind of swapping as the need arises. If we here actually just search for all of the sadist, which is of course just a plus 30% amp, where we can kind of compare between the weapons, we'll see that, yeah, the first wave, PF45 specifically, because yeah, there's the custom PF45 as well. That one comes in next. Although I would at this point basically not pick this, except for one quirk that they have, where especially the M45 and compatriots and the Card 45, they basically have a drop off that is quite instant. So basically, once you get out of optimal range, in a few meters, it basically drops to half. A lot of pistols are set up in either that way, or they have the alternate, which is that they drop off all the way to 100 meters. So if you're somewhat taking shots of opportunity at longer range from time to time, it can be a good idea to, for instance, go with this PF45 that has that trait. We'll kind of discuss that as well when we go into the review of these weapons at the end, and kind of show which weapons are one way and which weapons are the other way. Although for me, the only real contender is really this PF45 for that, because yeah, then we start getting some of the revolvers. Here we have the Harvest. Of course, the Harvest is just a better version kind of the 5.86 and 6.86, which are also variants of each other. And it is available from the holiday hoarder, the holiday loot goblin, as is actually by the time of release of this still likely available. It is very much more so an headhunter weapon than it is here. We're kind of already dropping because keep in mind that while this is not too far down, we're already a few percents down. And especially one of the downsides of the revolvers is when you have this big of a difference in mag size, their sustain drops off quite hard. So I would generally pick, even if I wanted to go with, if I wanted to go for more burst damage, I would just pick the M45s. And then their sustain is especially also much better, which is kind of if the upper bound is around the same edge, but the lower bound is so much higher for instance, the 1911. I will generally go with those. And yeah, you wouldn't per se want to use it in this sense. Although, of course, there is a place for the harvest, very much so. Then we see the D0s and the D50 coming in. And then, yeah, we're going with the custom PF45 and then the 586, 686. The custom PF45, of course, kind of the counterpart of the first wave one, but it just performs, they actually handle around the same, but this one is just, yeah, less output. It does actually sustain around the same level as well, although actually even still worse than that. So I would generally just not pick that when you can have either the PF45 here or the Card 45 there. Then the 93R is, of course, the 3-round burster here. It is, without weapon handling, very unusable to me. It just pulls up way too hard. If you're kind of using it in a sense where you are, where you have some weapon handling to kind of keep it on target for those 3 shots, you could make it work, but of course, when you're doing that, you're also taking away even more damage in it. I found myself just not wanting to use this at all. Same, for instance, for the D50, which handling-wise is very poor. The D0s at least can be kind of decent hitter there. One thing those do have, which is that they have much higher alpha damage. Although the way that we're kind of using it with the build here, we're kind of tech tanking and we have a big shield in front of us, so we just use that shield to close the distance. We don't per se need popping out, getting 2 hits in, and then hiding again. We can just stand in front of the enemy. We're really actually outputting in a very DPS sense. We're pushing damage that way. So all of the revolvers really, of course, much more lean towards their base damage being high. The way that we're kind of using it here, not really what we want after, what we're after. The PX4s show up here as well, and the X45s. They're decent, but yeah, we're kind of getting out into the weeds. Then as well, what they don't have is, so for instance, what we saw with other weapon types is usually if they're really going lower in burst, their sustain will be much better. Here, really, the sustain end is really in the hands of the card. It's kind of like the fall of this category. And then the M45 and the Tactical 1911 being much more like the FAMAS of this category. And those two being up here kind of, yeah, invalidates a lot of the choices below, except for, yeah, that range thing, which we'll discuss a little bit in the review. Then we have the military M9, which is kind of so low that, yeah, we won't even really consider it. Its sustain is decent, but then, of course, yeah, we could just bump this up to the Card 45, all right? Also, none of these weapons, optimal range-wise, differ enough from each other to really make that be a choice difference. Well, yeah, especially the Card 45 and the 1911 have just 12 meters as their optimal. Going to 16, as some of the other weapons have, is not that marked of an improvement, especially when, if you are in optimal, then you're losing quite a bit of damage. And with this, of course, we want to be in optimal, we want to be in close range, allowing us also to kind of hit those headshots. And then last, but definitely not least in this case, is a TDI card custom. What is happening here is, of course, that we're losing that second, the second stats of pistol that we would have. We're gaining that skill tier from the TDI card custom. And that skill tier, of course, by itself will make it so that actually on most red builds, this would be our go-to. We just grab this, especially for using it with a revive hive. Spell out that trick is just that you can use a revive hive, you can toss it, you can equip the pistol, you gain an extra skill tier at that point. The hive will now have, if it was just at 1 charge with 0 skill tier, now it has 2 charges. While you're holding the pistol, you toss it out for an ally that is downed. they can get revived by that second charge that is in there. Once it's out of your hands, basically, you can swap off the pistol and continue doing what you're doing. But then you're still keeping one charge, basically, for yourself. And that is a very important thing to have. And that's why, yeah, TDI card custom is basically for red build still the go-to. Like if the build is very much set up as a red build and you have a revive hive, you basically go with the TDI card custom because you don't really care that you're giving up here, for instance, this 10% on the DPS basically versus the normal card. You much more care that that you have that ability at the ready. So yeah, we've kind of seen all of the weapon types in between. Let's kind of start discussing some of the talents. So we saw somewhat the order of basically the weapons as we can kind of sort them, especially here, of course, on this end on the burst, but we kind of discussed the sustain as well alongside of it. Here I've highlighted all of the tactical M1911s basically. So we're going to compare basically how the talent list as we go through here kind of will go for us. Of course, as always, Sadist is at the top of these. It's a 30% amp. It is, though, of course, with the build as I have it set up, not going to be always active. If we're just activating it basically with its talent, where every third kill is basically, or after every 3 kills, we're setting somebody to bleed. Yeah, you don't get this. If I'm running alongside of an OD, though, now it's a little bit more consistent. So you kind of have to apply your own game knowledge as well to this, or just have me explain it here as to how this kind of will apply. Because while Sadist is, of course, very high, it is very conditional. But yeah, we can kind of have that in here just as a comparison point as well as just being a 30% amp, basically. Then we see actually the choice I kind of went with for the build itself, which is Killer. One interesting thing here actually is that we see that actually the 1911 with Killer is above the M45 with Killer by a tiny margin, but you know, it is above it. So what is happening here? The lower crit chance, crit damage means that actually what I'm doing is actually on the, as we go onto its stats, which are over here, is that, as you can see, it is actually pretty, so the 200 is for the tactical, the 163 is for the non-tactical. Both of them are at 60, but of course to get to that 60, we have even flipped one more crit chance on the build. So the crit damage of the build itself is very low. So we're gaining actually more out of that Killer because our crit damage is very low. For Killer as well in this listing, I've actually, so most of the weapons for talents that do not care about crit chance, we've landed on, for a lot of them below 60 actually, because that makes more sense overall. It's balanced more so at 53, 117 than 60 or than 59, 105, for instance. That would actually be a worse ratio for crit chance, crit damage for this build. But then of course for Killer, we've set them all to be as close to 60 or at 60. But yeah, we're getting basically more out of Killer on this other 1911. Now, why didn't I still go with this, for instance, for that build? And the reason is that the difference here is tiny, but also something that will actually will have covered by this point when you see this released, as yeah, Killer actually does care actually how much crit damage you have, and that will actually apply to how often it will activate, as we'll have by now seen in that other video. But yeah, if we alter basically the crit chance, crit damage of the builds and such, especially talents that, you know, if we're lower on crit damage and we're gaining the same amount of crit damage like with Killer, it being actually lower will kind of actually be better for the build in the DPS sense. So sometimes that does matter. But yeah, here Killer, of course, we need 1 kill to activate it. It is not always active, but it is overall, especially for instance, that build that I have it set up there, it is very much a solo build, basically. At most duos, maybe. Killer, all the kills are mine. Killer is basically a very simple choice because, yeah, we're not really set up to get Sadist. For instance, we could have, for instance, a Ridgeway version of what we have there, but we have a Memento, which is much more useful, to me at least. So Killer is the one that I'm going there with. And of course, yeah, Killer, a very good pick. Then we have actually Close and Personal. especially for one with damage dealing killer is a very good pick. Close and personal here, it being especially as well just weapon damage means that us being at 30 memento stacks and then also being at grade 27, this is kind of the worst case scenario for it. Close and personal as well, we need to be in a very close range to get that first kill, then it activates. I much prefer killer over this. On a build where you can get it, the difference between them, especially that this doesn't have the conditionality of a crit chance, so you could use it on builds that don't use crit chance. But yeah, overall, it's not really a useful talent to have. Although yeah, as we can kind of see, it is landing decently high. Then we have finisher. Finisher, of course, will apply on swap. Basically, we get a kill. When we swap, we gain crit chance, crit damage. If we were to want to use it on the pistol, we would have to swap away and back, kind of busy little beast style. Finisher, of course, is much more for just getting the kill and then swapping to a main weapon, which is very useful for that because you can increase your crit damage, especially quite heavily for a different weapon. But in this case, we're kind of using it in the sense of, yeah, we're using it on the pistol, which is not generally the way that you're going to use it. We do see, though, that it actually does gain quite a bit, and especially if we're kind of comparing having finisher versus close and personal, I would actually take finisher and that swap over taking close and personal in this setting. Here's what Optimist is quite low because, yeah, again, we are pretty high on the weapon damages. Optimist is actually not performing that well. Optimist as well kind of wants you to reach the end of the mag quite consistently, which will mean that, for instance, for revolvers and such, that would be much more consistent. But especially killer being so much higher above it, yeah. Not a general pick I would go for. We have also Ranger here at 12 meters again, kind of how we had it with shotguns, as that is the first place where optimals start to fall off. We're kind of using it basically as a 6% amp mark. So yeah, we kind of see that this is the point where the 6% kind of would land for a damage talent. And yeah, then we have salvage. We're not actually doing any fast stands here, but we are doing salvage. Salvage, of course, on kill, you have a percentage chance to refill the entire magazine. It is actually a very useful talent sometimes. In the setting that I'm using it here, I would much prefer to just have the reload because we're hiding behind the big shield, of course. But if you're kind of maining the pistol, this doesn't feel too bad, except that, yeah, you do give up, especially if you're comparing it to killer, you're giving up a decent amount of damage to get this talent. But definitely, yeah, somewhat of a pick that you can go with, especially as well for actually headhunters, if you don't want to use determined. Although, yeah, preservation and such, of course, is also a really good pick if you're not going that route. Although, as well, you would generally go then with Regulus, especially. But yeah, salvage actually, reloading the weapon for you can be very handy. What we see as well is if we then go back and kind of go through the perfects as we have it here for harvest and for the TDI card, I've actually put them in all the weapon talent categories, and they kind of follow the same order of things for all of them, with sadist and then killer and then down the list basically. We kind of see as well continuously that the TDI card, of course, is losing quite a bit versus the card 45. Losing that 10 detox is a big deal. What we have here, for instance, as well, Orbit here with perfect finisher, definitely a worthwhile tool to use nowadays, more so than ever. The 5.86 being, and the 6.86 both, being now basically the hardest hitting pistols per shot, actually makes it so that you're quite likely to, if you've already weakened an enemy or such, to kind of actually be the finishing shot quite consistently, because it does do a lot of damage on that one shot, on per shot, basically. Having a high alpha and triggering and then swapping back to trigger a perfect finisher. And of course, perfect finisher being 10% more is kind of nice. very usable gun as a secondary, but you're then using it kind of as the secondary, and it's competing especially with the TDI card custom for red builds. That is the place where you could make a point, especially for orbit, to go in that slot. But generally, we end up with TDI card custom just for that hive trick that we explained earlier. Then I'm trying to see where the other the mosquito, the Mozzie special here. What we're doing using it here as is actually I'm smearing the damage, because of course we have perfect breadbasket. Breadbasket, you need to hit body shots and then a headshot. That's also why it's not included per se in any of these lists, because it at its perfect rate, it's already not that great either, because you're getting one shot basically out of it. Here we're smearing basically the improved shot over 4 shots, so that we're basically getting a DPS as if we're 3 body shotting and then headshotting, 3 body shots, headshot continuously. And even in that case, it is pretty low down here. Much more consistently, we could make killer happen. Although of course this does not require a kill, which is one of its benefits, where we can and actually is one of the few ways that we can get that, because for instance as well the close and personal things like that, they do require a kill basically to activate them, same like killer. So say this of course wouldn't, but yeah, that is kind of conditional on other things basically. So it does have that going for it. You don't per se need that kill. You can activate it if you're fighting something strong and you can't actually trigger other talents. But I would just for general use much more eagerly grab a perfect or a killer instead of this perfect breadbasket. Then also we have that all the way down here, we should have the lightning rod. Yeah, and there we have it, which is perfect salvage. Although of course here, of course, in the sustain end, we'll kind of see the effects of salvage a little. Here on the burst end, it basically has no effect, of course. And then as well, salvage, because it's a PF45, basically a custom PF45 with perfect salvage, it's just higher activation rate, as we'll kind of see in the sustain. They'll be side by side still, but of course the lightning rod will have a higher activation rate than other things. Overall, not per se that usable. Of note as well, actually, one of the things that I noticed while making up this list is that the lightning rod and the mosquito, or no, not the mosquito, the Mozambique special, both of those actually don't have blueprints, and they're actually nowhere listed that those are missing from the descent pool. We should actually add that in at some point, because yeah, the lightning rod and the Mozambique special do not have blueprints. They should be in the descent pool, of course, being names. And yeah, I feel just nobody really cares enough about them to have noticed to this point, including me until making this list. So yeah, overall, talent-wise, as we kind of saw, I would definitely go with killers, very much, especially for the build that we're kind of using there, where it's a solo build. We're getting all of the kills. We'll get enough activations out of it. You could, of course, as well go with, for instance, yeah, salvage for the more sustained end of things. But the reload of the pistols is it isn't as useful as, for instance, steady-handed would be to some LMGs. Finisher, of course, can be a really good pick. The TDI card custom, just by itself, with a decent talent, can be a really good pick as well. So yeah, let's actually start moving on to the sustain side of things. And indeed, on to the sustain. Here, again, we're putting the 100% mark a little bit lower. We're putting it actually with one of the first sadist weapons, or the first sadist weapon on this list. And the reason for that is that above it, all the salvages will live, of course, because if we take away that reload, kind of, which is somewhat realistic, somewhat unrealistic, the trigger rate actually for salvage is so high that if you're set up on a build that can kill with just a few shots, you're very likely to get enough kills to kind of keep it going. And I've tried it out, for instance, in Summit and such, especially where you're on the lower floors and you're just getting a lot of reds and purples. Salvage triggers pretty consistently. Then we have also, yeah, perfect salvage, of course, in that mix for the lightning rod. Well, these two are, of course, side by side with the custom PF45. The lightning rod would just have higher activation amounts for that. But what we'll especially see if we were to take the reload away from the M45 and the tactical 1911, they would be overall pretty high up there as well on the sustain end. But if we actually go to, for instance, here, looking at them with sadist, and actually let's Control F sadist here. We have that the card is, of course, kind of the sustain king, as we kind of were talking about. But of course, still pretty high up there on the burst. Really what we see is only the M45A1 and the 1911 kind of beat it on burst as well. And that's kind of the really the reason why I kind of pick between those two. It's between the M45 and the TAC 1911 versus the Card 45. If you're kind of maining the pistol as the main killing tool, and then as well not doing it in a headhunter fashion, which is a lot of caveats altogether. But that's what we're doing kind of here, where you're kind of using them in a shooty build. And that's why I basically have both on that build at the ready. Sometimes I feel the card, especially with its reload, is a little bit more relaxed. But then the M45, especially with its higher burst, kind of feels, it kills. It does feel actually as well as that it kills faster when you're actually using it. It is usually, I say, around 2% difference is something that you can feel if you're actually familiar with the build. More than 2% difference, you'll feel a difference generally. Anything under that is kind of, unless you're directly A/Bing them together or calculating it out, it's really hard to tell, at least for me, I feel. And then, we see actually as well, the first wave PF45, which we kind of saw be decent on the burst end as well, kind of close to the Card 45. It's here then, but its sustain is substantially lower. And it doesn't actually have much benefits over that. One thing of note as well here is these aren't, of course, automatic still. Having a lower rate of fire can be very useful, but that's also here then the Card 45 and the M45 and the TAC 1911 are actually overall some of the more are the lower rate of fires, so we need to click overall less than we would need to, for instance, with some of the other weapons. Although the difference between them is not big, because 310 to 380 here is not a big jump, not as high as going from 600 to 900 or going from the 275 of a Mark 17 to like a 420 of an ACR SS or such in the past. So very much doable getting this out, because this is just, you can just divide it by 60 basically, and just by itself as well, 600 RPM is 10 rounds per second. So 310 will be basically 5 and a tiny bit, 5 and 1/6 of rounds per second. So 5 clicks basically a second to get it out. The 370 would be 6 and 1/6 basically. So none of these are really that hard to get the click number for them. But I feel the 310 of the M45 and the TAC 1911 and the Card 45 actually does help them and also makes them somewhat the better choices overall. We don't see actually that many surprises, especially as well as we're kind of talking about the 93R being very low on the sustain. What we have as well is actually, this is the reason why we don't really pick any of the, what generally would be considered more the headhunting weapons. So we have the D-Ceroses here, both the versions, the D50, the 5.86, the 6.86, even the Harvest. While they can kind of compete on burst end, as we kind of saw, they have usually small mags. You quite often hit the reload basically, even if their RPMs are actually even lower and would, be more comfortable that way. That does actually not save them that much on the sustain end, and this is really what falls away for them, because their drop off towards sustain is much more succinct, and they just drop in damage pretty quickly. And in the way that we're kind of using it as continuously shooting, that wouldn't be our go-to here. Then talent-wise, we kind of have the same setup, although of course salvages kind of go all the way to the top, as we kind of saw. Not much of a surprise, of course, if we just remove the reload out of the pistols, they do much better. But of course, getting, for instance, a few kills, or well, you need just one, but it is of course a chance activation. Do get that reload more so with some of these weapons might be actually easier to do than having just 6-shot with a Diesel. So it's less realistic, for instance, for those. Although of course they do much more damage per shot. So situationally very usable, but generally I do lean more towards the damages, of course. Killer being so high up on both burst and sustain kind of makes it, for me, a very easy pick to go with that. Sustain wise as well, we don't have any other talents like pummel or something that also have like a damage component plus a reload component, or a reload reduction, as we would have with fast hands. We're not really going for those kind of things. All of the max sizes here are way too small for fast hands, for instance. The optimists are pretty low, the close and personals. The rangers here, of course, at the ranges that we're kind of using them, won't work out. So it's mostly as well, it's kind of where we don't have the full spectrum of talents to kind of pick from, because a lot of it is just not gonna compete well enough or actually be kind of that useful here. Of note as well is that for instance, things like the exotics are actually pretty low on the sustain end as well. So for instance, even because what we saw is that even the killers are kind of up here, but even the busy little bee with 10 stacks is already kind of far below them, or well, kind of below most of them, especially with the sadist. Then as well, the Liberty, alongside of its, so if we take the Liberty with 30 stacks and no headshots, which is this one, which is kind of a realistic way to use the Liberty, is much lower, especially here on the sustain end, and that is actually hurts it a lot as well, alongside of how annoying it is to use the Liberty versus a lot of other weapons, as it jumps around quite a bit. So yeah, we've kind of talked through the sustain. Let's actually talk Headhunter for a little bit, and then take it afterwards to the stash and kind of review everything. And to quickly talk about Headhunter for a second here as well, of course, that's a different way that we do use our pistols quite often as well. That's basically completely based on the base amount, and then somewhat, for instance, as we saw with the shotguns, sometimes mod slots can matter. For instance, the M870 does beat the SPAS kind of because it does have more mod slots than it, allowing for a little bit more headshots, so actually that they kind of catch up to each other. Although their difference as well on base is pretty small. Here, the Harvest is the clear winner by quite a bit. It is, they've changed it with the PTSs. It went from being a 20% damage buff and an 18% rate of fire reduction. It went actually in the PTSs to 10% on the damage side, and then 9% on the RPM side. And that made it a lot more balanced than, although, well, it's not, because the 686 and the 586 is already the second place, the Harvest being that much higher than it. This is basically the go-to. This, of course, is just farmable only in the from the loot hoarder during seasonal events, basically, as we have, for instance, now still the Christmas one kind of going on. Hopefully they'll add a few, because we have summer, we have kind of one in autumn, kind of. It would be nice to have one in spring as well. Then at least every few months, people that kind of want to get the Harvest can kind of get it, because it's definitely the go-to for pistol determined if we're going that route. And then on the other end, we kind of have the Regulus, which has an even higher base than it by quite a bit, actually. But the Harvest, of course, we can free talent, but the Regulus then also has head explosion. So it's kind of the go-to between them. It kind of depends what you're kind of doing with it, especially Determined, of course, being very popular. Harvest kind of goes with that. If you can't have the Harvest, a 586 or a 686, they're basically the same weapon. They're the variants of each other. The 686 handles a little bit better, having a tiny bit more stability on its stat block, but it's only really noticeable if you're ABing them. So it's not a big difference. Then we kind of have the D-Soroses, but they're already dropping off so much that you wouldn't really consider them. The D50, of course, used to be the old king of that. It very much isn't anymore. One thing of note as well, especially a lot of those mods, the 30% handling mods and such, a lot of the pistols can't actually take those. So they don't actually affect them here. So for instance, one thing that could be maybe a thing is that we could put a much bigger weapon handling mod on, for instance, one thing than another, or a stability mod or accuracy mod. The 5.86s and 6.86 have the scope, which we can get some weapon handling off of. But actually, that will further hinder things like the D-Soroses, which don't actually even have those options. Because the D-Soros, this one has the underbarrel, which you can't actually put anything really useful for this in. The D50 has the same scope, but yeah, it has much worse numbers now. And one of the things actually that I quite enjoy and has made pistol headhunting a lot more as well, the determined one. Something that I've been doing a little bit more is that the Harvest is so much more handleable than the D50. I really didn't like the handling of the D50. And after the D50, it's basically, yeah, all of these are kind of out of the range of actually headhunting with, in a real sense, because just their numbers are too low. Except for reanimated, of course, right? With near animated, we could still go with that. With the changes as well, with the D50, the Liberty, which sometimes would get used in place of, for instance, Regulus or such for headhunting, really doesn't have that anymore. Of course, one of the things it does have a weapon talent that adds to weapon damage, but that's weapon damage on body shots. So you can't really stack it up consistently when you're headhunting with it as well. So yeah, it doesn't work out well that way. Yeah, I really got hit with the D50 going pretty far down. So yeah, headhunting wise, Harvest, failing that, a 5.86 or a 6.86, they're basically the same. And yeah, we come to the part where we go into basically reviewing everything that we kind of learned, or at least may have learned from those lists. We're going to start here with the exotics, and then we're going to swap accounts and go to my second account where I actually keep all of the high-end weapons. As with all of the other weapons, I have one of each variant, basically, of a weapon, just to be able to always check how they kind of differ, if any. Because sometimes, yeah, it's weird things creep in between two weapons that should be the same and sometimes aren't, or are different in other ways. Here, let's start with the Busy Little Bee. As we kind of saw the Busy Little Bee, especially if we're using this, we'll be using it for the talent, of course. On its just base damages and such, it isn't that usable. But its talent, of course, is very good. We get 20% weapon damage, and this is just pure weapon damage per stack. We can get up to 200% of that, basically, with 10 stacks. And yeah, we're just basically marking enemies and then swapping over. The thing is, of course, if we're kind of like, yeah, swapping over, we're usually already like going away from the pistol and trying to use it on a main gun, where maybe we're doing something with this weapon damage for headhunters or such. For general use as a maining pistol, not that great. As a secondary, of course, one of the downsides of it is this eats up an exotic slot, which could be a Scorpio, which could be a Strega, which could be a Chameleon, which could be a Bighorn, a Pestilence, other things. That's kind of the downside, and why we generally just use Busy Little Bee specifically when we need it, because if we're going to use it, there are other tools that are a little bit more useful quite often. Moving on to the Liberty. The Liberty, now with its talent, actually is much more usable for what it was kind of meant for, which is kind of getting these damages and then healing, especially as well, up your shield, because this is what we generally use it for. It's just to have it as a mechanic to heal the shield for tank builds. In the DPS sense, kind of, it has very much lost its ability to do decent DPS, because it never really had that good. But what we kind of saw is, especially if we have this talent kind of going and we're just body shotting with it, you can get decent numbers out of it. But that is, of course, after 30 stacks, for instance. That is 30 trigger pulls. And yeah, the issue is more like with each of those trigger pulls, this weapon jumps around so much. The thing is that it has a high horizontal recoil. One of the things is as well that stability and such does not even save that, save you from that, because stability actually only affects the vertical recoil. So the weapons like this that have a very high horizontal recoil, the vertical part of it does of course kind of get mitigated by the if you have a lot of weapon handling or such. But the horizontal doesn't, and it still jumps around from side to side quite a bit. And that's kind of more the downside for using this weapon. It is just a handful, really, which is kind of fitting for a weapon with its high of a caliber as it has. Then we come to the Mosquito. The Mosquito was with its ability to apply that debuff to the enemy, basically, after 5 shots. The use of that is very good, of course, for this, meaning that for tanks and such, this has become much more of a go-to, especially as well when we can use this to forcefully target, as it states there, to have the enemy forcefully target you, together with that, having that 25% more, as it states here, damage to armor. It isn't. It is damage to armor and armor plates, similar to Sledge, but not additive to it, which is kind of odd as well. Because, yeah, they're separate multipliers to each other, so you gain a lot more than that. And yeah, it's a very good tool for that situationally. But trying to main it just for its damage or such would not be a way to go for us, for instance, here. But yeah, we use, as with a few of the other pistols, as we kind of already discussed, like the Bazilliobi, situationally, it can do great things, of course, because it's this applying to, for instance, 7 other people can really turn the tide of battle, because you can also apply it, and then this will last for 5 seconds on the enemy, so you can swap off of it as well. Then we saw the Regulus. Actually, in the DPS sense, the Regulus actually can hold its own as well, which is kind of interesting, at least on the burst end, not so much on the sustain end of things. But of course, the way that we use the Regulus is especially for this really hard-hitting base damage that it has, meaning that it outclasses even the Harvest on base damage and can hit harder than it. It's because the decrease, basically, with the recent balances is that its reload time got increased heavily, and that you definitely feel that. One of the things I've been taking to, especially for instance on the high-end Headhunter for pistols, is to swap out the contractors, for instance, for a Zvia, or for the Eagle's Grass specifically, which, yeah, that extra weapon handling, you definitely feel the difference, and giving up that little bit of DTA is kind of okay, especially as we're also getting one more shot out of it. Regulus, of course, can do Regulus things. It really doesn't have real competition, except for if we're kind of going towards Determined, which of course can make things easier than this. But yeah, very much the go-to for headhunting still. And we go to second account to look at the pistols, as yeah, that's where I keep my pistol collection, although I'm basically rebuilding it over there. As yeah, main account got a little bit too full, so I was like, let's move the pistols at least over here, so that the stash on main account doesn't also have to have all of these in it. And of course, I need one of each basically for usage with the burst and sustain tables, just to make sure that we have the right stats and such. Starting out here with the 586. The 586, of course, is kind of the same as the 686 base stat-wise. The 686 actually handles a tiny bit better. It pulls up just a little bit less, but they're both really handleable. The 586, of course, has the Orbit as it's named. The 686 has the Harvest as it's named. All of them as well are pretty good headhunters, very much especially the Harvest, of course, with a higher base than the 686 by 10%. Making it that, yeah, this is why there's a grade 25 one with Determined. It's usually also not by stash. It's actually on a build. Very usable for that role. That's really the role that they fulfill. But then as well, we should always consider, for instance, yeah, here, Perfect Finisher, having that being on the Orbit. Especially with a hard-hitting weapon, we can kind of just pull it out. If an enemy is weakened, likely kill it off with just one shot and then swap back. 10% more on the crit damage end and 5 crit chance more here. The 5 crit chance, you generally won't really benefit from it because you would have to be at 25 crit chance to get the full benefit out of this. You wouldn't really set up any build that way unless it's for a very specific situation, but for general use, just want to work out. But just 10% more crit damage is already a worthwhile thing, of course. And Finisher is one of those tools that, especially if you're kind of using it as on a red build, basically on an AR build, on whatever build, and you're just using the pistol slot to kind of get a little bit more damage out or such, Finisher is a very good way to go. Although, yeah, we'll see the other choice in a little bit as well for red builds. If we then go on to the 93R, the 93R is the 3-round burster here. It is unique in that way where each press of the mouse, it actually fires 3 rounds, making it actually that, yeah, it is kind of like the M16A2 that we have in the game. It is just as unhandleable as that, as yeah, the second and third shot quite often are kind of hard to keep on target, just because you're not per se controlling the fire rate. It does need some training for you to kind of get it to actually land all 3 shots on target. It being a little bit unhandleable like that makes it kind of unusable in my opinion. Moving on to the custom PF45 here, together with actually the first wave PF45. Even though the first wave PF45 actually has different mod slots, they're very similar. This one has only 10 crit chance. The custom PF45 has all of the crit chance slots, so we can put 20 crit chance on it. But the first wave actually has enough mitigation, has enough extra base that, yeah, it does actually compete with that one. But neither of them are really good picks just because there are better picks above them, especially the tactical 1911 M45 combination and as well the Cart 45. Moving on to the D50s. The D50s used to be the headhunters as well, so I have a grade 12 here with determined on it. This kind of lives in the stash now. It isn't that useful anymore. It's also why I need a second one without degrading just for the burst and sustain. 12 is a very annoying number to work around, and I don't want to waste exotics on it, because yeah, I would be wasting exotics as the Harvest especially and the 686 and 586 by extension really outdo this now for headhunting. If you're going headhunting, these are no longer really a choice. Same for the Diceros here with the main Diceros and then also the snub-nosed Diceros. The snub-nose just does not have the underbarrel. Also, it handles a tiny bit worse. It pulls up quite significantly, actually, more so up on every shot. And then but it has more base damage. The normal Diceros does have that 10% crit chance mod available for underbarrel, but then a little bit lower base. So in crit sense, it would be better to go with the Diceros over the snub nose, but neither as well. We wouldn't pick per se neither for headhunting, just as the 586 and 686 handle better, similar or better, and then just yeah, do more damage basically. Then we come to the Cart 45. This is one of the main picks, together, of course, as well with the named version, the TDI Cart Custom, where we get that skill tier. This is my go-to, basically, for any red build. I will generally have this just for that trickery with the Revive Hive. If I have a Revive Hive on a red build, this is basically what I'm going to go to. Even sometimes when using it, for instance, for pulse and such, swapping to the pistol, pulsing, and then swapping back gives you just a few seconds more of it being highlighted and such, and a little bit higher, bigger radius, although the radius isn't that important. So you can even do things like that. And then my go-to picks for that as well, if I'm using it as a secondary on a red build, or well, tertiary actually, is going to be either Sledgehammer, as I have here, or Finisher. Both of those, of course, applying more so to well, you kind of trigger them with Sledgehammer, which is Sledge, because even normal Sledge at 15% is a very useful tool. It still also applies to your allies, even though it says it is only damage to apply to from the agent that applied the mark. This is just a wrong text, basically. That was how it worked in PTS1. In PTS2, they already revised it to be just less damage, but still applying as a group buff. And we just see those numbers as well. When the mark is on enemies, we see that it does that amount more damage, basically. And yeah, this one we can trigger with some grenades, of course, and then just swap to our main and kind of shoot there. And same for finisher. We just get an enemy kill, swap over, get a little bit more crit damage to go on our main weapon. The downside, of course, of the TI card custom is that, for instance, in the sense that we were using it on that build as just a main weapon, the loss of detox here is a loss in quite a bit of damage. Still fine for finisher to get that kill in. With sledge, we're not per se even really using it. Of course, we're just holding it while the grenade explodes. But yeah, it is definitely a loss if you're trying to actually main the pistol. When you're not maining the pistol, though, this is one of the top picks, basically. If you are maining the pistol, then yeah, just a normal Card 45 is one of the two main picks, as the other one being the TAC 1911 and the M45, which are basically variants of each other. Because yeah, you get that detox, and that makes it as a main usable weapon quite useful, especially if you're trying to get, for instance, on skill builds or such that are already at 6 skill tier, so they wouldn't benefit from that extra skill tier anyway. But you want to use them to get maybe a future perfect kill in pretty quickly. Then we come to the 1911s. We're going to clump them all together, even though that the normal 1911, it has compensation here on its base, but it doesn't have actually any mod slots for crit chance or crit damage. Well, crit chance, especially with pistols. It does have the magazine slot, of course, but the other two, the M45, as we have it here, together with the tactical M1911. The tactical 1911 is actually slightly better. It pulls up a tiny bit less if you're kind of shooting them side by side. You see the difference a little bit. It also shows it on that bar a little bit, having a little bit higher stability on the tactical 1911. And yeah, that's the other side that is very usable, the M45 A1 and the tactical M1911. They have a little bit higher burst, a little less sustain than the Card 45. Overall, generally, yeah, my go-to picks alongside of the Card 45, if I'm using the pistol as a main. And they handle pretty well. Both this and the Card 45 have very low optimal ranges, not reaching out very far, but a lot of the pistols, because even some of the better ones like the military M9 actually don't reach up that much higher. They do go out a little bit further, but not significantly so. Most of them are either 12 or 16, basically, where their optimal range starts to drop off. Then we have the military M9. One of the things actually with the military M9 being quite more improved is that this is one of the core weapons that it's the first, it's the lone weapon that you always will get when you go into descent. You don't get a random pistol. You always get a military M9. And one of the first things that I actually noticed, a lot of the pistols have actually been pulled up quite a bit, because the Card 45 used to be the old king and kind of was on burst and sustain kind of all the way up there, kind of like the 612 in the shotgun category. The military M9 was much worse than it. It actually got pulled up. All of the other pistols kind of got pulled up. And that actually helps this in descent quite a bit. Outside of descent, though, yeah, I just want to pick this. It doesn't have enough real compensation for just having one slot, basically. For crit chance, it just doesn't have the damage compared to a lot of things around it. And it doesn't really do, for instance, as with some of the other weapon categories we saw, some of the lower weapons in burst were higher in sustain. Here, really, the sustain is the Card 45 with decent burst, and then the better burst, but a little more sustain, kind of goes to the M45 and the TAC 1911. We do have the officers M9 here as well, kind of similar of a variant of that, but here then we have all of the mod slots available. It does, of course, have less base damage to kind of go with that, but yeah, it doesn't actually hold up well at all against, as I'm kind of in the background kind of looking through the list where it kind of landed, and yeah, I have to go way lower than I even expected. And that's kind of the downside. Like, I just wouldn't pick this when we have better picks than it. It does handle pretty well. That must be said. It has a little bit better optimal than for instance, a card would. But it also, when you are in optimal and the handling difference isn't that big, you can just do more damage with those other choices. Then we come to the PX4 Storm Type F. and the PX4 Storm Type T. If you're wondering actually what the difference between those two is actually that they are actually different calibers. If we kind of look at the muzzle slot here, this is a 45. This is a 9mm on the muzzle. But yeah, they don't really, they don't have different damages or such. Their damage is the same if their bar was optimized. Their base is the same. They are basically overall the same weapon, but then yeah, one of them has they take a different muzzle. This might make some difference to somebody leveling up, doesn't have all the blueprints, but we're kind of like trying to find a problem for this to solve. Neither of them is really worth using. They're pretty low down the list on burst and sustain, and yeah, they don't really have anything going for them. Then we come to one of the last high-ends here, and one of the ones that actually does have a quirk, and a soul quirk here in here, where some of the ARs have the same kind of drop-off range, where they, at the range that they drop off, instead of dropping off like the white line is doing here, which is from a card 45 that is actually equipped on the character, this drops off to 100. So technically, the X45s, what they have going for them is if you're using them on longer range, they do have a drop-off that is going to reach out better, because especially if we're kind of shooting in this 30-meter range, they will outdo any other weapon just because of their drop-off being better. Is that actually a thing that we kind of want to go for? For me personally, not really. Especially in the build that we kind of are using as the comparison point here of being a tech tank. I'm going to push up into that 12 meters and kind of be in that 12 meters because I want to be there, and also that will help me get more headshots in, kind of bully the enemy as well to kind of make them not just sit down and maybe deploy their skills and such. They will try to just fight me, which is a very important tactic to kind of use along the way. But if the TDI card, for instance, or such didn't exist, we could actually choose this, especially now as well with, for instance, if we're trying to just get by the teeth trigger from the modifiers of this season, and then just get a decent amount of damage out of a pistol to maybe get an initial pistol kill for Pistolero or such. But honestly, we're now again kind of going into the weeds to try to find a solution for a problem of these weapons maybe not, competing that well. Because overall, yeah, we can kind of be brief, as we kind of discussed. For Headhunter, it is very much that we go with the Harvest. Otherwise, if the Harvest isn't available at the time and you don't have one, either go with a Police 686 or a 586. Both are very competent tools for that as well. Of course, Regulus kind of fits in that segment as well. Then we have that most red builds, you kind of just want to go with a TDI card custom. That skill tier is very useful for shenaniganery. You don't per se aren't maining it, so the lack of damage there is felt, but isn't the game ender, of course, and we're getting benefits for that loss of damage. Sledgehammer, Finisher are both very good picks, where we can basically apply a damage or a bonus from the pistol basically over to our main weapons and kind of elevate them that way. And then actually, yeah, if we're trying to main the pistol as a DPS weapon, as just a shooty gun, yeah, I'm gonna go with the M45s, the TAC 1911s, the TAC 1911s, not the 1911, not the M1911, and together with that, with the card 45s as well, where they the M45 / TAC 1911 has a little bit better burst, but has worse sustain than the card 45. So we kind of have some choices there. And then, yeah, talent-wise, of course, Killer works really well for maining the weapon. And that has really been my go-to for if I'm maining the weapon. Just because of how powerful it is, of course. And yeah, to kind of recap, as we did there, is yeah, the go-tos, of course, for pistols is very different. We have really three ways that we use them. One is just as on a red build, as a tool to either get more damage or kind of do special things. The DI card custom was always kind of in that slot, and yeah, we'll remain there basically. On most of my red builds, that is what I'm going with, together with either finisher or with sledge. Situationally, we can make either work pretty well. Perfect finisher as well is a decent choice. We usually don't put some of the exotics there because if we're kind of running, for instance, an AR build or an LMG build, some of the exotics of those are pretty well worth running, or just putting a Scorpio in a secondary slot on a lot of red builds is really good. So yeah, we just end up not using the exotics that much, but yeah, especially for red builds as well, Busy Little Bee, Mosquito can be very effective tools to use situationally. If we're going the headhunter route, which we kind of also just briefly discussed here, we're just the Regulus and the Harvest are very much the top picks, of course. The Regulus with its explosion kind of does really well, and of course can do things that no other weapon can do, especially when kind of paired together with the Dodge City Gunslinger holster. But the Harvest will allow us, for instance, to have Determined, which is very powerful by itself. Even without Determined, having, for instance, Preservation there, or even just more damage in the form of Optimist or such, can, of course, sometimes be situationally worthwhile. But yeah, basically, if we're going Determined, we're going the Harvest. And if we don't have the Harvest, then a 686 or a 586 will perform basically just 10% worse overall, as they have 10% less space. But still the top pick over any of the other available options after the Harvest. And then, yeah, in the way that we're kind of discussing it here in a DPS sense, where we're really maining the pistol, we definitely are going with the Tactical 1911 and with the M45A1 or with the Card 45. The M45 and TAC 1911, a little bit more burst, basically around the same handling, a few rounds less, a longer reload, meaning also as well kind of a lower sustain. The Card has a few more rounds, has a better reload, more sustain, but loses a little bit on the burst then just because of having a lot. They have the same RPM with the Card 45 having less base damage. So overall, those will be our picks, and especially Killer just really fits in well here, giving an options for pistol, because as well, I felt quite often in the past, we didn't really have good picks for if you're maining the pistol. Breadbasket was kind of a thing that kind of you could make happen, but now Killer being very potent, we can just slap that on there, and especially on a build where we're kind of going for crit chance, crit damage, it fits in really well. That has kind of revitalized as well my attention to kind of making just kind of shooty, not headhuntery pistol builds again. So yeah, that is kind of the conclusion we can kind of derive from all this. If you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as that is always very much appreciated. For our future videos, we still have MMRs to do. With the MMRs, we're definitely just going to stick with especially the bolt action ones and kind of talk about headhunting completely there, because that's really the way that we use those. While with pistols, yeah, we can go several routes as we kind of discussed there. So that will be upcoming together with character 4 and 5 with their build collection updates, and of course as well the Lengmo Pestilence build showcase will actually likely follow this up not too long in the future, as yeah we've been teasing it for quite a while. So yeah, let's get that one in there. So yeah, I hope you join me for those, and as always, have a good night.